Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hi, everybody. As some of you may know, over the past couple of years, I've done several webinars and video lectures on a variety of topics that also come up on this podcast. There is unfortunately a lack of qualified therapists who specialize in working with cult survivors and their concerned family members. And since I can only see a finite number of clients myself, I wanted to share insights from my 30 plus years of doing this work with as many people as possible. So, in pursuit of that goal, I've made all of my recent video lectures available on my website, rachelbernsteintherapy.com. You can find a link to the page in the show notes of this episode. There you'll find my lecture from the most recent conference of the International Cultic Studies Association, my, quote, Living in Freedom, unquote, series for survivors and their family members, and my recent lecture entitled Why Did I Stay?, which examines the many reasons that people have difficulty leaving high control groups. We plan on adding more video lectures in the near future, so if you have topics you'd like to hear me cover, please feel free to reach out to us and make suggestions. Today on the show, we have a returning guest, Jonathon Sawyer. There are some guests that we've had that really have made this lovely impression on the listeners and people who really cared about their story and listened in droves to their episode. And we're also wondering what happened and wanting to know if everything was okay, wanting to know how life has been since the time they were on the show. And so this is in response to people who really wanted to hear from Jonathon again and others who haven't had a chance to hear his first episode. Please check it out. Jonathon Sawyer is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. Working with the National Education Policy Center, John researches public and private education. Through his in-progress dissertation, John explores pressing tensions between the right to religious freedom and the separation of church and state, focusing on taxpayer-supported religious schools. Motivated by life-defining experiences in a school associated with the early years of the new Apostolic Reformation, John is particularly attentive to LGBTQ students who are subjected to religiously motivated discrimination. Through his work, John aims to educate his academic community and the public on the discrimination some LGBTQ youth may experience in taxpayer-supported religious schools. Yes, taxpayer-supported religious schools. You heard that right. He also explores how religious extremism radicalizes youth against democracy. John has also presented research on civil rights, education policy, and religion at the annual conference of the American Educational Research Association. You can find out more about John and his work at www.johnsawyer.org. Here is John now. I am so pleased to have John Sawyer back with me today. Your first episode was so powerful. There were so many people listening to it who were really moved by it, moved by your story, and also just how you tell your story and the wisdom that you share. Now you get to update us on all that you have been doing and all that you've been studying. And I'm so happy. And I'm happy for myself. And I'm happy for the listeners that they're going to get to learn from you today. Thank you so much for coming back.
Wonderful to be here. I so appreciated our conversation a few years ago. And it was really one of the first platforms that I've had publicly to speak about some of these things. And so grateful to you for the opportunity, Rachel.
I'm glad. It's quite mutual. And I know that there are a lot of things now that I want to be able to touch on that you're doing. I want you also to to spend some time reintroducing yourself to the audience and also picking up where we left off, because it has been a few years and you've been busy in that time. There are a lot of phrases that I would love to be able to explore more. This is just from my perspective, but please jump in with other ones too, like this idea of, well, the fact that there's taxpayer support for the influence of extremism within our schools, which is very interesting and disturbing. And just this idea of pluralistic democracy and really what that means and what that should mean, et cetera. But if you don't mind taking a moment and introducing yourself or reintroducing yourself for the people who heard you before.
Well, wonderful to be here with you all. I am a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I think a lot in my program about the intersection of religion and politics and education, particularly youth and adolescence. And my research and work has really shifted to thinking more and more about extremism, religious extremism. And I think it's something that is related to much of what I shared on your program before, Rachel, pertaining to some of the influences in my upbringing. We covered a lot of ground. As I listened to that podcast again, it's quite a bit. But the primary influences that I see now as having molded and manipulated my mind to a significant degree was the charismatic and Pentecostal movements. Now, I want to clarify that not all charismatics and Pentecostals are extremists. There are many sincere believers of the Pentecostal variety, but there are people today in particular that have been influenced by charismatic and Pentecostal Christianity that are bringing into public consciousness some of what I think is some of the most harmful aspects of that faith tradition, including rhetoric of demons, demonology, and practices of exorcism, some of the things that we touched on before. And I'm particularly concerned with billions of dollars flowing into religious schools now, that the state is continuing to be so enmeshed more and more with some of these extremist forms of religion that we need to pay attention to what is happening, not only to individuals that might impact their psychological and physical health, but also, as you mentioned earlier, Rachel, democratic implications.
Right. When I hear people say that they were shocked by when something is repealed, like abortion rights, they're shocked by certain movements that seem to have taken hold. Then I hear people like you talking and saying, everyone needs to be paying attention. These things are happening. They're happening while you're busy living your life, doing your thing. There are tons of movements with tons of money that are working to influence people, influence taxpayers, influence children. It feels so fear-mongering. I mean, there's no way for it, and I think, not to seem that way if we're talking about exorcism and we're talking about demonology. It's very, very fear-based. But I'm sure it gets frustrating for you and others who are really trying to stay up on what's happening to see the blinders that are on people, and then they're surprised that things are repealed, or they're surprised that whole huge swaths of our society suddenly believe that something is true or believe a certain way. I'm wondering for you, has that been your experience, that you're trying to kind of say, please notice or please wake up to this?
Absolutely. I, at times, have experienced some self-doubt, thinking, do I really want to go down this track? Because some of what I talk about sounds and feels so conspiratorial. But there are radical forms of religion that are influencing politicians today, that are influencing education leaders. Recently, the superintendent of public instruction with the state of Oklahoma, who is a school choice advocate, who's somebody who has been backing the possibility of religious charter schools, for example, in a post on the app formerly known as Twitter a few months ago, referenced the transgender community as demonic. And you have many people at high levels of government involvement in education, in politics, who are using this language. And my concern is that people look at the language, if they haven't been raised in those environments, are prone to discount it as hyperbole or as figures of speech. But this language actually has implications for what people believe and how they practice their faith. Faith can be a very good thing, and it can be used in ways that is altruistic and positive for society. But we don't pay enough attention to how faith and religion can be used to harm others. And so that is the work that I am doing, and I'm seeking to draw attention to this language that people might just discount and move by and dismiss them as radical and quote unquote crazy or extremists, and say, no, there are people in Donald Trump's orbit, for example, that are his spiritual advisors, that teach and preach and believe these things about demons. And if people want a bit of a raw and vulnerable dose of what my experience was in a school associated with some of these groups, go back to listen to Rachel's podcast from a few years ago, and I give some details about that. One last thing I'll mention before we engage a bit more is in the late 90s, there were networks that began to form that were part of what is called the New Apostolic Reformation. This is a term that was coined by a gentleman named C. Peter Wagner, who was a scholar of church growth movements. He was raised a Congregationalist and then began to embrace the charismatic and Pentecostal movements. And he began to see a variety of megachurches with these celebrity pastors as on the cutting edge of what he called the second apostolic age, preceding the quote unquote second coming of Jesus Christ. And the school that I was a part of that Rachel and I talked about a few years ago was one of the first documented schools that was part of that network. The gentleman that I discussed, the leader who I believed to be a prophet and apostle, was part of these early NAR networks. And I mention this because you're seeing a lot about the New Apostolic Reformation in the media today. And there is this idea that is being promoted by these groups that Christians should dominate culture and these 7 mountains of influence, which they call government, business, the arts, media, family, religion, and education. And so this moves beyond mere influencing policy with your faith. Nothing wrong with that. It's part of our pluralistic democracy. But this is conquest-oriented rhetoric, and that's a concern for individuals and for society.
Wow. Conquest. That's a terrifying word. I think about, just from my own tradition and growing up Jewish, hearing a lot of stories about things that happened and are happening still with people who believe that they know what's best. And that, there's a whole history of sort of convert or die that has been a problem for not only Jews, but many others. And so the whole idea of conquest does give me chills. There's also something so superior, so entitled about it, which doesn't at all feel spiritual to me. I've never quite understood how those go together, but that there is this sense that this is what everyone needs, and this is what's right for everyone. And so I just wonder about that. Is that something that you find that they're trying to start and acculturate in people from a young age in schools that they're helping to fund? This idea that this is what all the world really needs to be.
That's the concern. And it's based not only in my own experiences, having been a part of an early school involved with one of these movements, but there are reports of late that have drawn attention to K through 12 education, where they are very clearly teaching about these 7 mountains of conquest that I mentioned earlier. And those schools are largely unaccountable. We have what I believe is a great right of religious freedom in our Constitution. And yet, what we're seeing lately is this idea of religious freedom being yanked out of the concern of the framers of the Constitution regarding government entanglement with religion, which in large part comes through finances. And so money is attached to this. There's huge amounts of money in religion, and money is funneling into schools through vouchers and other advocacy efforts for some of the schools, not all, but some that may be radicalizing students into a form of Christianity that is domination oriented. And I think some thoughtful Christians, and especially conservative Christians who are drawn to the story of Jesus and are drawn to the story of the best parts of what I remember in reaching out to those who are marginalized and those who have been downtrodden in society. I don't think this conquest domination oriented form of religion represents the best parts of Christianity. And so part of what I'm trying to do in my work, even as one who leans on the more progressive or liberal side of things, is speak to conservatives, because it's going to take thoughtful liberals and thoughtful conservatives to recognize that extremism exists and that your religion is being hijacked by individuals and is being wielded for political ends that in the long run, I would argue, is not good for a religious believer of any persuasion.
Right. Well said. And I think, if you take that equation with the starting with the word thoughtful, liberal, thoughtful, conservative, that yes, you're going to have things that are reasonable. You're going to have discussion. You're going to have decisions that feel like they're coming from a place where people have actually been able to sit down and discuss. But because there's such a reactionary way of handling it now, it feels like it's like they're talking over the thoughtful, any kind of, fill in the blank. And because that does happen, that it turns out to be a louder bunch, or just a more manipulative group, or more secretive kind of group, where they're just not being upfront about all that they're up to and what they're raising money for, etc. Becomes harder to battle, doesn't it?
It does. And there's some excellent scholarship of late from people like Catherine Stewart, people like Ann Nelson, who wrote about the Council for National Policy. There is some work from scholars such as Andre Gagne, Fred Clarkson, and Matthew Taylor that really delve into the New Apostolic Reformation, among others. And I do think it's important for folks to go to those resources to educate themselves on how policy is being manipulated to undermine democracy and the pluralistic democracy. But the point that I'm trying to emphasize, the contribution that I'm really trying to hone in on, is the individual implications for someone's psychological well-being. Because we didn't get to where we are as a society today without extremism, authoritarianism being present in families, in schools, in churches. And one of the primary concerns that I have, based upon my own experiences, is that those who are harmed or are discriminated against, sometimes, if not reflective, if they have not benefited from some professional services to help them make sense of their own paths, become the ones who discriminate, become the ones that harm. And so if you have more and more radical forms of religion being funded with taxpayer dollars, you have more and more people who are being subjected to demonizing rhetoric about the LGBTQ community. And some of those individuals, for example, may themselves be grappling with their own sense of identity. And yet, because of their political and religious conditioning, are trained, indoctrinated to go into the world and to perpetuate that same discrimination on others. And you have others who may not have wrestled with their own sense of identity as it pertains to sexual orientation or gender identity, for example, who are hearing these messages and they're saying, oh, the LGBTQ agenda is all demonic. And therefore, I'm going to go out into the world and proclaim that and further harm an already marginalized group. And so those are some of the concerns that I see, especially at the K through 12 level in education and its intersection with radical forms of religion.
Okay. Just the language that is so manipulative, that is so much a part of brainwashing that's used here, the idea of an agenda. And also the word flaunt. I remember that was what I was raised with people who were gay and lesbian. They were flaunting it just by, I don't know, breathing, just by being. And that somehow, if there is a book in a school that talks about people who are same gender who love each other, that is furthering the agenda. But somehow, if there are lots of other books talking about people who are born female, born male, who are together, it's not an agenda. They're not flaunting it. They're just being. I found that interesting, of course, and disturbing as a teacher and as a therapist, just seeing the language that's used, that it can be so coercive and destructive. So I wonder more, just if we can expand on this discussion about people who are gay and lesbian and trans, because very often these are the communities, as you're saying, already marginalized, that then are given really a hard time, who are sent to places for forced conversion. I mean, it's very ugly. I wonder about this and what your concerns are moving forward when you see the influx of this kind of teaching in schools, and it's also well funded.
I grew up on that in part. I, as early as 8 or 9, remember hearing about quote unquote homosexual demons, hearing preachers rail against what some would call back then homosexualism. And adding that ism to it adds this sense of this being some well-formed agenda. And you hear similar things today with people using the word transgenderism. And I want to clarify a point that I made earlier, that in adolescence, formation of identity is a complex thing. And there are internal subjectivities or internal experiences that somebody may have, such as attraction to another person, as some would say, the same sex, or they may have perceptions of gender that are different from the norm of society. And then with those inner experiences that people have, there's then the external of laws and policies and curriculum and preachers and ministers. And those two things come together for some in a way that can lead a person who may, for example, have an attraction to another male, in the example of an adolescent boy, who is then being taught that there are demons associated with their attraction, who then may, to use the popular language that I don't love, but it's common, is may go into the closet further and further. The way that I think about that is less about a closet, because there are implications for some thinking that there's a choice to go into the closet, or that somehow somebody is just so self-loathing that they're in the closet. But I think a lot about people who may be so sincerely believing the religious and political conditioning that they've been exposed to, that they're almost invisible to themselves. There's almost this inability for them to be able to identify as gay, lesbian, transgender, whatever category you want to use. And those individuals may become the political leaders who we hear railing against the LGBTQ community today. And I say that based upon experience because I experienced some significant harm from an individual at the school that Rachel and I talked about a few years ago who performed a quote unquote exorcism on me. And at the time, I thought it was exorcism from a homosexual demon. And this individual promoted these very harmful ideas and still does, by the way, right now, targeting the transgender community. But his community fell apart in Southern California in the late 90s because he was in a homosexual relationship. But this is an example of someone who may be just one of many. And so, as a society, I think we need to think more and more, not only about the people who have been subject to this rhetoric and then come, quote unquote, out of the closet and are being activists and advocating for the LGBTQ community, which I think is so important, hugely important. However, we also need to think about the ones who may never, quote unquote, come out of the closet because they've been exposed to such radical indoctrination through religion and politics.
Oh my goodness, what you're saying is so powerful. Getting swept up in a movement that is so destructive, that is counter to being able to have self-acceptance and good self-concept, just in terms of confidence, etc. Knowing that a lot of the people who are so destructive in these settings are people who are grappling with their own internal conflict because of their own who they love and who they're attracted to. You know, when I had seen it before, and I guess I was using the language that I had been taught, that it was about people being self-hating. But you've introduced me to a new idea just now, which is someone being invisible to themselves. And I think that's very powerful because if you can disengage the self from the self, right, from your mind, then you're going to lose sight of what it might feel like for someone to attack you for being that, because you're kind of almost dissociating. And so I think there are a lot of people who stop themselves from mistreating others because they think, how would it feel if someone did that to me, especially for the same reason? But if you're invisible to yourself, feels like you're a step removed enough where you can kind of torture somebody else for being the same as you. It's so multi-layered. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and I write about it in an article that I published through Taylor and Francis, and I introduced this term of self-invisibility. I'm not the first one to be thinking about these things. I draw on the work of Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist in the mid-20th century, and he discussed the experiences of African Caribbean people who were subjected to French colonization and who had the inability to see themselves as Black because the word Black carried such negative connotation. So these individuals that he was treating as a psychiatrist, when confronted with the idea of skin color or the idea of being Black, would externalize that as, no, those are those people over there. We're not one of those people. And I'm very careful in the article. You can't draw direct parallels between a person of color's experience with racism to LGBTQ discrimination. But Fanon is very clear in his writing called Black Skin, White Masks that he's thinking about the psychological mechanisms of being subjected to generation upon generation of discourse that dehumanizes you. And so I think humans are humans and our brains work in similar ways. And so irrespective of color of skin, there are some ways that we can think about people that may have inner experiences that some might call LGBTQ, but who do not associate with those terms. And as you said, disassociate from a fundamental aspect of their humanity and then perpetuate discrimination upon others. So there's part of me when I hear some of the most extreme rhetoric from far-right politicians, I'm just going to call it a spade right now, understanding that there are folks on both sides of the aisle who may approach things in unthoughtful ways, but I'm thinking about the rhetoric that we hear on the far right today, and I hear language of demons from education leaders and politicians about the LGBTQ, particularly the transgender community. There's part of that, of course, that angers me, but there's part of that that I look at that individual and I wonder, what have you been exposed to in your life? What traumas have you experienced that have brought you to this point of being able to marginalize the already marginalized to such a great degree?
I think it's so incredibly powerful to be able to see also about the dehumanization. Yeah, I mean, I'm going back to my own tradition and my own history because it's what I know the best. But the idea of Jews, and I'm sure others, being called things like vermin during the Holocaust, right? Then you can exterminate vermin. There is something really important about the dehumanization that causes people to not have the same level of feeling and conscientiousness or conscience. If you can think of someone as demonic and then you're supposed to either avoid that person or try to banish them or stop them in some way, vanquish, all the terms that are connected to demonization. Same thing with what I've heard from people who are gay and lesbian and trans, and also women raised in a lot of religious environments where they have had to learn that they are in equal measure a human being to others, to men. And that I've heard also from a lot of men in these situations who said they had to learn that a woman is a human being in equal measure, and same thing with someone who's gay and lesbian and trans. And so I think anything that is going to keep the playing field very unlevel is going to make sure that some people are going to be seen as those you're supposed to listen to, care about, and others you just don't have to. That's a frightening dichotomy.
Yes. The notion that that there is this way of living and being in the world that is quote unquote normal is really just the water that we're swimming in, that we perceive without self reflection as normal. And yet you'll have people who will say, well, then if you're going to accept somebody who's transgender, then you're going to accept, and then they'll insert some radical thing that then they use to say, we're going to go down this path as a society that's going to lead to our destruction. And I need to challenge that, because what we're talking about is people who are simply getting up out of bed in the morning, brushing their teeth, going to work, occasionally getting sick, having loved ones who pass away, dealing with all of the stressors of life, and finding community and love and seeking to live out their lives as anybody else. And yet, the type of demonization that we're hearing on the far right today, if we don't rein it in, and again, it's going to take both thoughtful liberals and thoughtful conservatives, I fear, without being fear mongering, could lead to some things that are not good for people and for our society at large. And so that is where thinking about the way that our Constitution was written, it was written in a purposefully vague way to affirm the rights of citizens to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We had the religion clauses that elevated in this radical experiment for the first time for individuals to worship how they want, believe what they want, and have religions separated from government so that individuals who have different ideas or live in different ways or make sense of the world in different ways can live together in this pluralistic democracy. And what you're hearing now on the far right is this idea that somehow separation of church and state is a myth. And there's this, again, this subversion of what I see is with all of our flaws, in our country's history and with our country's founders. But what I see is some of the beautiful aspects of our nation's founding and what could be a way that humans can coexist, to use a buzzword that people don't like, but can live together with differences, whether that be along the lines of self-conceptions of gender or sexual orientation or religion. And that's a clarifying point that I want to make in my work, is that I support the right for individuals to believe what they want. I even support the right of individuals to disagree doctrinally on matters of gender identity and sexual orientation. That is a right that should be preserved. What we need to think about is when that right crosses into this assumption of privilege that allows you to marginalize further and harm others, both psychologically and in some instances physically, based upon your religious belief. That's an area of law and policy that people are scared to touch because of the right of religious freedom, but it's something that I think your work speaks to, Rachel. It's the work of others that are thinking about extremism that would be helpful for us to navigate some of these precarious waters.
Right. So interesting too, and so well said. I think it's kind of fascinating, the irony. There's so many things that are ironic here with people who will say, we know what the founding fathers really meant. I can't imagine saying that out loud, actually believing it, and it not being a joke. Like that, just having that lack of hubris to that degree, that you are sure that you knew what a whole group of other people were really talking about and really wanted for this nation, even if they didn't mention it. But now you know. Right. And it's like low-hanging fruit too, because it's one of these things where you can't ask them, so, if these are people saying things that feel really kind of coming across like they're very sure, and they have an audience that listens to them, then it's kind of an easy thing to convince people of, when you can't call up the founding fathers and say, hey, listen, just have something to run past you. Is this true? What's also interesting is that I think extremism is symbolic to me of a disorder, of some kind of psychological issue, something gone awry. Usually, at least to my, this is not to say 100%, but just to a certain degree, I think there are more people who present with certain levels of anxiety when they're involved in extremist kind of thinking. Just because when you talk to people, when they're open to talking to you, they will then talk about what their fears are. And I think fear will often lead a society, lead a group of people to be an either or kind of group rather than both and. Because that is too messy, it's too something, it's too threatening. And I'm curious what you think about that idea.
Yeah, I think that this indoctrination of fear is quite present in religious traditions and religious extremism. And I can speak from personal experiences, having been raised with feeling as if the end of the world was right around the corner, being raised with these apocalyptic scenarios in front of my young, impressionable mind, often being raised with ideas that we've discussed regarding demons. All of that is very related to religion and religious mythologies. You're going to find ideas about demons and those kind of things in a lot of different traditions. But sort of going back to this point you made about the Constitution, is there's a way that religions can be wielded in a fundamentalist orientation, which is the way that I think some people are approaching the Constitution. Is, you've got people that say this is the Word of God. Everything we need to know about how to live life is contained within these words, and the words say what they mean, and there's no interpretation we need to bring to it, because it is what it is. And you get that same type of rhetoric in people who are talking about the Constitution and what the founders meant with the religion clauses. But that I see is related to your question on fear because I think this fundamentalist orientation to religious doctrine that is impressed upon young minds is a form of coercion that impedes the ability for a student to ask critical questions about certain things. They may be able to ask critical questions in other domains, but because they've been presented with some of these fear dogmas to such a degree that questioning those could threaten their very selves, or even are being taught that, for example, affirmation of LGBTQ identities could lead to national weakness and the destruction of humanity as we know it. I mean, that sounds hyperbolic, but it is what you hear. It's what I heard, and it's what people are saying even today. And if we care about living in a free society, and care about democracy, then drawing attention to the indoctrination of fear, to the way that religion can be used to coerce, and the way that religion can be used to cause actual harm. And that's something that I don't feel like has been grappled with enough, is that in order to win a case in court, for example, you need to be able to prove that there was some type of harm. And there is harm that is played out through people who experience severe anxiety or post traumatic stress or lose jobs and have various other ways that their lives are negatively impacted by these dogmas of fear. And it's important, I think, for us to consider moving forward.
Yeah, I want to make sure to talk about that. I think it's interesting when you're saying that they are kind of messing around with the Constitution. And I think also, there are a lot of people who will invoke God in this. Well, God has taught me this or told me this or instructed me to do this or Jesus or lots of other folks and things, entities. If it were not so dangerous, I would be able to liken it to something like my older sister trying to convince the babysitter that our mom did say it's okay for us to stay up and watch the Carol Burnett show, even though, right, she didn't. But that you can just sort of rewrite the script or history to suit your needs. And, it's human nature. People do it all the time. But when it gets to this level, you really want people who are adults to, I mean, this is going to sound very biased, but I want them to have grown up enough to say, you know what, this is actually the way it is. These are the rules. This is how it was set up. We need to find a way to live within it. And we also need to find a way to see what the merit is of this rather than fighting against it, that there might be some safeguards in place that we should be paying attention to. But I think if people are so driven to have it be a different way, I think, because of fear, then they're going to ignore what could be actually good logic involved in this decision making. And so let's talk about the dangers, about what you've noticed or what you're worried about religious tradition, religious teaching, and the harm that it can cause and the harm it's already caused.
Well, I think the take that I think is one that I want to stress more and more is that religious extremism does not benefit religious believers in the long run, because individuals who may have an inclination to spirituality or to faith, who are then subjected to some of the type of harms that we're discussing through religious extremism, those individuals may discard religion altogether. Those individuals may, even for a time, become anti religious. And when people are subjected to some of these harms, whether it's in a Christian group or any other religious group, some of these individuals, if they have been able to self-reflect, will leave these institutions and diminish the likelihood that religious institutions themselves will survive. And so I think it would benefit religious leaders of any persuasion in our free society to think about ways that the people who are invested in their religious tradition can be served in ways that benefit them, in ways that allow them to disagree with others respectfully, to think critically, in ways that allow folks to see their involvement in religious organizations as a benefit. And I think the direction that we're headed right now, especially with all of the talk regarding Christian nationalism and some of the extremes on the right, is you're leaving a whole lot of people out who are Christians or other believers who are not represented by these largest voices. And yet, if these largest voices, these loudest voices, rather, continue to gain political power, what is it going to look like 20 years down the road when people who have been harmed by, quote unquote, this politicized religion begin to turn the tables and point fingers at religion? I think that's where there's this beauty of this, the Establishment Clause and separation of church and state is it's in part not only to protect people's right to dissent and believe as they want, but it's also to preserve the good of religious organizations for society.
Interesting. Oh, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it from that direction before. Right. And I think, yes, there's a lot that we can look at about the philosophies, the ideas from when our country began and what was okay at the time and what's no longer okay. I'm thinking about slavery, and I'm thinking about how, when they say all men are created equal, but except for, the ones we own, I mean, like there's a lot that we could poke holes in, but this idea that there really should be a separation is, I think, a really important and novel idea that comes out of a society that people were trying to escape from, that they were escaping from, I think, for good reason. And so it's like the lessons of history get lost in this movement, I think. What do you think?
I agree. I think that I think it is important to name racism. It's important to name that our fellow human beings were subjected to inhumane conditions by some of the individuals, not all, but many, who wrote the Constitution and that founded our nation. Those individuals, not to give them a pass for the harm that was perpetuated, however, are also products of their time, had come out of centuries of violence with the state and religion being enmeshed. People literally burned at the stake for believing differently, wars being enacted over religion. And while there were many aspects of our founding that we rightfully should look at and reckon with, we should also recognize the context that people were in, that they were dealing with, and think about ways that they were constructing a government that would allow us to criticize the practices that were harmful today. So if we want to preserve that right and preserve the ability to dissent, preserve the ability to name injustices when injustices happen, I think it's so important to, I guess, for lack of a better word, throw the baby out with the bathwater. So.
Right. Right. I always found this phrase very chilling, the phrase holy war. Because, right, I mean, it's something that I think there's nothing holy about war. But also, when you call something a holy war, then you're justifying it. And you're saying that somehow it's sanctioned by God. And you have God's support in this. I mean, I think I have this image in my head of God and Jesus, Buddha, everyone sitting around and going like, yeah, I know they keep quoting us. But we never like the over their heads. We never said that. And I think it is really incredible and also huge hubris to say this is what God has destined us to do and has made okay for us to do, to really destroy people to further our cause. But I do worry about that. I mean, without sounding paranoid or conspiratorial myself, I have to be careful about that. But I could see it going in that direction if people are so whipped into a froth thinking that this is what is needed for everyone or else.
Yeah, and you're seeing that recently there was an article about the GOP convention in Texas where language of quote unquote spiritual warfare was being enacted in the political rallies. You see this type of language of warfare and spiritual warfare being enacted at some of the Trump rallies right now. And it is hard to talk about this without sounding conspiratorial. But if you actually look at the footage and think about some of the things that are being said, and then also think about the fact that there are true believers that may take that sort of what they would say is an idea about what's happening in the heavenly realms with spiritual warfare, but then bring that into the natural realm. That's a concern. I mean, I recently heard a pastor who's part of one of these new Apostolic Reformation groups, who, by the way, went to the Bible school that I went to that we discuss in your podcast, who's starting to gain some traction with conservative activism in Texas. And he was talking to his congregation and he said, no, we're not about violence. We're not about war. But let me tell you this. If we get really good at what he called taking ground back from Satan with this quote unquote spiritual warfare, that we might actually start a war not meaning to. And he said that to his congregation.
Wow.
And he's involved with politics. And he was rubbing shoulders with Congressman Matt Gaetz recently, who we recently saw on the news. So people need to pay attention. Yes, this is extreme. I wish nobody was subjected to this kind of rhetoric and dehumanizing language and language of spiritual warfare. But people have been, and it's being integrated into politics in ways that are concerning for both liberals and conservatives. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, and that very slick way of talking about it, it's just sickly, that it might just have to happen. It might just happen, and like somehow in some passive way. I'm not going to make it happen, but it might happen. It might have to. I mean, it's like a parent who is abusive towards their child saying, well, you know what? If you hadn't done this, I wouldn't have needed to do this horrible thing to you, but you brought it on yourself, which is just as sick.
Right. When I heard that, again, I'm speaking with somebody in the North Texas area who went to the school that I talk about in your interview. And I've actually recently done an interview with Steve Hassan on it as well. But that was the type of environment that we were subjected to as students at this school. And that's why I'm concerned about taxpayer dollars going to education where people are learning these type of things, because I don't think it's good for democratic stability in the long run, let alone for somebody's mental health and well-being.
Right. I absolutely agree. So I want to, have you share with us what more you would like us to know. What is happening out there that is good for us to keep our eye on, and what have you learned in your studies? Because I want you to be able to help us see what movements are going on, what kind of players we need to be watching out for, the rhetoric, to be careful about all of it. Go for it.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Right now, I'm thinking a lot about these new apostolic and Reformation networks that I mentioned earlier that, again, don't represent all charismatic and Pentecostal Christians in the United States, but many Pentecostal and charismatic Christians and others in the United States are starting to look at these new apostolic Reformation leaders as prophets and as apostles. And so, as apostles, they believe that that these individuals have the right to govern not only their churches and their schools, but also the society at large. They believe that prophets have the ability to read into contemporary politics, things pertaining to the end of the world and things pertaining to all of these, what religious scholars would call eschatological ideas. But there's a group out of Colorado Springs, for example, known as the Truth and Liberty Coalition. So I'm just going to name names because you asked me to pay attention, that we need to pay attention to folks. The Truth and Liberty Coalition has people on its board, a guy named Andrew Womack, another individual named Lance Wallnow, who are heavily immersed in some of the ideas regarding demonology that we have talked about. Just look up Lance Wallnow, Wallnau, not to give him more attention, but he is rallying votes for Donald Trump and what he calls the courage tours right now, and inciting people, working them up about this integration of radical religion and politics. But the reason that I bring up this Truth and Liberty Coalition out of Colorado Springs is they are masters at networking with other organizations that on the surface the public might look at and think are less radical or more temperate. So, for example, on their website, they have an educational resource center where they're recommending people to these classical charter academies or to other private religious schools or online Christian schooling. And all of that, for somebody who is committed to their faith and want to have a religious oriented education for their child, there's nothing wrong in the grand scheme of things with that. But you're finding powerful organizations like this Truth and Liberty Coalition who are increasingly networking with others in the evangelical and conservative Christian community, even some in the conservative far-right Catholic community, that are all working together. And they may not agree with each other on doctrine and various other things, but they are, many of them, taking this conquest way of thinking about schools and thinking about society. And so that's just one group among others to be keeping an eye on. But when you hear language of demons from political mouths, don't just brush that off as somebody who is using hyperbolic rhetoric just to incite a crowd. Think about the actual people that are, and students and young people especially, that are influenced by that, and what that means for the world that we live in. And what can we do to draw attention to that? What can we do through law and policy to minimize some of these harms? I'll just say it. I don't think that somebody experiencing a physical assault, such as I experienced at a school associated with the New Apostolic Reformation, should be legal. But people don't want to touch those things because of the religious influences, or they'll use language. For example, when I shared my story with you, Rachel, a few years ago, I got big pushback from some people who were part of that group who said, you were just talking about deliverance prayers. And in these Pentecostal and charismatic groups, deliverance prayers are implemented as though they're going to help somebody through their emotional whatever they're dealing with. But the association with deliverance prayer is like you're actually going to be free or liberated. But in those circles, they're talking about demons. They're saying you're going to be delivered from demons. And so then that is actually a form of exorcism. And that is actually a form of assault on some people, both psychologically and physically. And so we need to think about some of the language that people are using within these groups that may sound altruistic and beneficial, like we're going to set you free, but actually harm you psychologically and otherwise.
Oh my goodness. Okay, right. I mean, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about cultic groups and we talk even about relationships with manipulators is that they will manipulate the language. And if they can manipulate the language, they can manipulate your emotions in connection with it. You hearing that someone's going to set you free, right? You're not going to get anxious necessarily unless you know what they really are referring to. You're going to think that it's benevolent and it sounds kind and good, relaxing, relieving, a lot of very positive things. And so you're not going to have your guard up too, which is really cruel, to take people's ability to protect themselves away by using that kind of deceptive, positive, beneficent kind of language. I think it is incredible to go over these kinds of phrases so people know to watch out for them. And what are some other phrases that might come to mind?
Well, if you're going from the vernacular of religious tribes like deliverance prayers, those kind of things. But you're then going into the political arena today. The word school choice, for example, if people hear school choice, they think, oh, choice. Choice is a good thing. But it's important to think about the fact that school choice often is about the government funding religious education. It's about the government possibly funding radical religious education, some of which we have discussed. And it's also about preserving, there's research out there that shows that people, for example, who are benefiting from vouchers that assist people to go to private schools, many of them are people that are already wealthy and privileged and are getting an additional benefit. And so not only is that happening, but you're also eroding a public education system with all of its flaws that we could be channeling resources into to serve all students. So language like school choice. When you hear people use the word governmental schools or failing schools, that is another signifier of people that have a strong political bent to undermine public education, and often are individuals that are, not all, but some are teaching things about demons that we've discussed. As I mentioned earlier, a gentleman that's part of this new Apostolic Reformation network, often his courage tours that are really Trump rallies in the guise of religion, but he's bringing on people to tell these horrendous stories about experiences that students have had, and says that people are being indoctrinated to become transgender, and that people are being indoctrinated to become LGBTQ. And so we all need to flee government schools. In fact, the Colorado GOP recently published something that encouraged all Republicans in the state to leave public education because of this fear of indoctrination of people into quote unquote transgenderism. Rachel, I walk around my neighborhood, I drive around, and I'm in a pretty progressive area. I don't see that happening. I don't see people being indoctrinated to become LGBTQ or indoctrinated to become transgender. What I see in public schools is people grappling with a diverse society and finding ways to affirm individuals based upon their own self-conceptions. Are there missteps along the way? Are there teachers that do things in ways that are inappropriate? Yes, but there are also ministers that do that as well. And so thinking about the language of indoctrination that is being wielded on the far right is another important thing, because nobody wants to be indoctrinated. But what do you do when you're saying everybody else is indoctrinating your children, but you're actually perpetuating harmful indoctrination? That's a pickle, and that's a dilemma.
Yes, it is a pickle and a dilemma, and it so often happens. And it seems to me, I mean, I say this, I would care about this anyway, but just as a mother of someone who's trans, who is now so happily engaged to and is just loving life, who has they have such a kind heart, such good people, and they've been through so much just from having, the time during, as their body is forming and changing, but each time they look in the mirror, it's sort of betraying them more and more from their mind's eye to what the body is looking like. And it's just torturous. It can be quite torturous to feel like you could be talked into that and then want to endure all that needs to be endured, or whatever surgeries you decide to go for, or whatever else, that are all personal decisions. It's part of the reason that I get really pissed off when I hear about these kind of fringe culty groups like Twin Flames and others, where they're pushing people to transition, to take hormones. It should never be something that someone can push you to do. And it causes the people themselves, I think, to become invisible to themselves. Like, I don't know who I am, and I was sort of pushed to be this new person. It should always be something that comes from inside. And I think the only way for it to really be meaningful and for it to feel right is if it comes from an internal place. So I think the whole idea of indoctrination is doesn't fit here at all. But it's another use of fear-mongering language that is to address that person's fear, to address what they're scared of happening in society.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Rachel. I mean, we all wrestle with identity as we mature and identities. And what is something that I hope listeners of this podcast will think about more deeply. And I guess listeners of your podcast are probably already thinking about these things deeply already. But going back to the discussion on the language of fear is eclipsing the humanity of what somebody is working through, how somebody is coming to their own self-conceptions, and not to paint everything in a deficit narrative, but it's distracting from some of the challenges psychologically and others may be having to work through in order to come to a place to be able to affirm who they are and live a happy and joyful life. And the other thing that you're hearing a lot right now is this idea that quote unquote transgenderism is a mental health disorder, and that's being preached by people like Vivek Ramaswamy and people on the far right. And that's what you heard as people were beginning to come out as gay or lesbian in the mid to late 20th century. You heard that same rhetoric of this is a mental health disorder. I would ask those individuals if there are any listening who would say, yeah, I agree, being transgender is a mental health disorder, to actually go a step further and to think about the conditions of our society, of our culture, of our churches, of our schools that are accentuating somebody's own struggles with mental health that have nothing to do with sexual orientation or how they conceive of their gender identity, but it's about the conditioning of harm and of fear that is provoking those mental health concerns.
It's quite incredible how, when you were talking about people being marginalized and then marginalized again, kind of hit while you're down, it is so incredibly unfair. And I think about, actually, it just had me remember a story when I was working at the Cult Hotline and Clinic in New York, which is now no longer, but it was part of a larger agency, the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services. And we had a team where when we had a new case, we needed to bring it to the team. And as part of the team, there was a psychiatrist there, Dr. Eugene Glynn, who was already in his maybe 70s at the time. This was in the 90s. And I was expecting that he was going to be old school psychiatry, and that with a case that I had with a family where it was same gender parents, that he would want to, kind of saddle them with a diagnosis that somehow this was a pathology, that they were gay. And so I said, I'm almost afraid of bringing up this case with you because, pardon me, but you seem kind of old school, and I just don't want them to have to deal with that. And for a diagnosis to go in their file that has nothing to do with what they're dealing with and what they're trying to address. And they're lovely people, et cetera, et cetera. And so he took me aside after the meeting and he said, I can tell you think I'm not cool. And I said, yeah, actually, yeah. And he said, well, let me tell you something that I'm not at liberty to tell people now that he has passed away and it's now known. I can talk about it. But he was the life partner of Maurice Sendak, the author, the children's book author of like Where the Wild Things Are and others. They had already been, by that point, been together for over 40 years, living in secret in Connecticut. And he wanted to be open about it, but the publishers and all the media people were saying, no, Maurice cannot come out and be openly gay because he's a children's book author and he will then be seen as not safe with children. And it will destroy him and destroy his career. And so they had to live in secret forever until they both passed away. And it was really quite incredible to see that in so many different contexts, people just are not able to be. And people are given this, we're given, or society's given this impression about them as being the source of the problem. But really, it's the intolerance and it's the lack of acceptance that is the problem, because they're lovely human beings. So I think a lot of people have these stories, and it just is such a shame and such a crime, I think, when it happens within a religious context where a lot of people will go to religion and to spirituality for solace and for love, and they get quite the opposite.
Yeah, a lot to respond to. I guess a couple of things that come to mind, back to your comment about language, is right now we're seeing a lot of attempts to ban books in schools, and often you're hearing people say, well, we're rooting out pornography from children being able to access pornography. When you hear that, I would agree with that, but I don't want children looking at pornography. What that rhetoric is doing is saying that books, for example, that may represent what is outside of what society views as the norm of man, woman, they're saying that somehow that is pornographic. And so taking it one step further and thinking about, if somebody says, well, we're banning pornography in schools, and they're using it to say that somehow that's part of the quote unquote transgender agenda or the LGBTQ agenda, maybe think about what is the curriculum that they're actually targeting. And in many instances, it is books that are allowing family structures that look different from the quote unquote norm, for those students to be able to see that and be affirmed and loved and cared for and live healthier lives. And I think the other part of this that is important and that I think about a lot, and in fact, at times I've received some criticism on, is I'm sharing these stories and can at times be perceived as being on some type of anti-religion crusade. And that is not my intent. In fact, the more that I've shared some of my own stories with fundamentalism, the more I've shared some of my own stories with discrimination in religious contexts, a surprising thing has happened. I found parts of me reawakening to spirituality and parts of me reawakening to faith in a new and deeper way than I once had. And I'm less inclined to define what that means now, but it's a surprising thing. And I think it goes back to the necessity of recognizing that not all people who are in religious groups are doing and teaching the type of things that I'm drawing awareness to, but the type of things I'm drawing awareness to are there, and we need to talk about them, because it may not be good for students' own mental and emotional health. It may not be good for society, but it may also not be good for a person's religious belief in religious institutions.
No, it's so beautifully said. I know that our time is drawing to a close here, but I am so grateful to you for the way that you share things and the way you're looking at them. And I have a feeling that you're in the process of kind of doing even more research and moving on with other ways of, really trying to figure this all out and educate the public. And so what are you working on, and where can people find the work that you've already done?
Sure. As I've been on a few podcasts lately, I decided I needed to finally get a website up. So I've got one at John Sawyer, that's Jon Sawyer, SAWYER.org. And you can find what I'm doing there. I am working on my dissertation, and I am thinking about religious extremism in schools, broadly speaking. And I am thinking about the ways that law and policy could be crafted to address the religiously motivated harm that we have talked about in this interview and on our previous interviews. And that's tricky because religion is such a personal thing, and there are these religious freedoms. And I think we've lost sight in some ways of how we can structure a society that is beneficial for religious groups. And so if people are interested in thinking alongside me and contacting me to share their own stories, to provide leads of educational institutions that may be embodying some of the types of extremism that we've talked about. I'm in the process of building a database where I begin to talk about in more detail some of the extreme aspects of religion that may be supported with public funds. And so I welcome all connections from not only Christians who are perhaps been part of this new Apostolic Reformation group, but people of other religious persuasions as well. I'm also, if folks want to follow me on Twitter, they can, or the app formerly known as Twitter, they can find me at John Sawyer, JonSawyer. And thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you again, Rachel.
It's always a pleasure. Feel free to come back on whenever you would like. And so glad that you're out there trying to, fight the good fight and educate people to be seeing what is happening around them and could at some point directly affect them. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
One more thing before you go. Thank you to Jonathon. Jonathon was gracious enough to come back onto the show because there was so much more to talk about. And I also really wanted to see how things were going for him since the last time we talked. It is really good to see all that he has done, all that he is getting to do, and all that he will be doing in the future. There's so many good points that he brought up that I want to be able to talk a little bit more about. There is this idea that I think pierces this naivete that a lot of people have about religion. And I feel wrong even calling it naivete because it shouldn't have to be that. It should be that you should be able to trust a faith. You should be able to trust a belief system. You should be able to trust religious leaders. There should be something different about them. There should be something different about all that. Different from gangs, different from fraudulent people, different from abusers, different from businesses. This is something that should be different, that should be sacred. And when something, it presents itself as sacred, as sanctified in some way, there are a lot of people who will do trust falls in that environment, just lean back and feel that they're going to be caught and held and protected. But a faith, a religion, is often going to take on the personality of the people leading it or the people who developed it. It's also only going to be as healthy as its leaders. And that includes the sub-leaders, those who are sent out to be the clergy in different locations. There are some people who have a perfectly fine experience within a religion, but have a bad experience under the power of a particular clergy person. And so it's still good to have safeguards, even though a religion might, in and of itself, seem pretty safe. You can still have a bad experience within it, depending on who you deal with directly. What is so interesting, though, about what Jonathon was saying is that he wanted to be able to explore how can a faith, a religion, be used to harm others. And I would add to that, why? Why would a religion be used to harm others? And that's when you get into the very human element of who runs them and who develops them. Because there are some traditions that say we are all equal. There are some traditions that, like Jainism, like Zoroastrianism, the Baha'i to a great degree, more liberal forms of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, But when you get hardcore, when you get into some of these groups that are singular groups like the Scientologies, etc., where they're not part of any other kind of organization and no one is watching what's happening there and they can develop their own rules and their own way of working on people and controlling people. And also the more fundamentalist branches of religions, then you have more of an ability, unfortunately, to do harm because there is the need to follow everything 100% or else. This is when you start to get into the fear that's laced within that. And you also get into a superiority and a looking down on everyone else and deciding what everyone needs and what everyone needs to believe. It is still a huge leap in logic, I think, a devastating one, where people die in the name of religion or they're killed in the name of religion. I will never understand that. And that's okay. I don't think it's actually understandable. That's when things have gone awry, when they've developed, kind of woven in with a pathology, the need for everyone to be the same or else. If you're trying to save people, why would you kill them? And there's so many arguments. There's so many things that I could jump in with here where I could try to infuse some sort of logical thinking, critical thinking, but it doesn't have a space here because this is where things have gone over the top. But I think it is really a devastating thing when people are raised with a religious tradition that has been beautiful to them or has been healing to them, and they see it being used in other very negative ways. The same is also true for Jonathon, who had a very mixed relationship with religion and talks also about the idea of being demonized or the need to have things exorcised out of you. When we move into that realm too, then we move into something that is psychologically devastating. And the devastation comes from being told that there is something that is evil inside you. There is something that you are that is demonic, and that it needs to be purged from you. And that thing can be anything that a religion decides is wrong with you. And it's different for different religions, although certainly there is some overlap. But when people see other people as having certain traits, not necessarily evil traits, not ones that are akin to sociopathy or any other kind of pathology, but rather a particular kind of gender identity or the attraction to someone of a similar gender. These are natural variations as they are seen within science, but within many religions, they are the thing that you need to get rid of in order to be accepted by God, in order to go to heaven, in order to be safe. And yes, there are a number of people who, when they go after you to exorcise you and to label what you have as demonic so that there is reason for you to have to get rid of it, they do think that they are helping you because that is what they've been taught. But what I also know is that when you have people who can say, well, you know what, I am actually okay the way I am, and I can avoid those kinds of religious traditions, and I don't have to get involved in that way of thinking, and it's separate from my life, then you can develop that kind of differentiation where as long as you stay away from that, you can have a life where you feel more accepted and acceptable. But suddenly, with these movements, when you have taxpayer support for this kind of thinking, which is happening more and more now, you now have an infusion of this way of thinking into things that are paid for by taxpayers, like our educational system. And what that means is that these poor people, kids to adults, then don't have a place to go. where they are acceptable, where they are accepted. Because now, not only are they going to be having to avoid, let's say, going to a particular church on Sunday, but can they avoid just going to school? Where are they going to have their oasis? Where are they going to have their place that helps them know they are okay, that affirms for them that they have rights, that affirms for them that they are the picture of health, not disease, not a diagnosis, not any kind of demonology. So we do need to be on top of this. We do need to make sure that there are places carved out still that are safe, that are emotionally safe, that are also knowledgeable, that use a scientific basis as the basis of their thought and their teachings, that use what we now know that is different from what was known during biblical times, where this isn't a disorder, this is being human, and that everyone deserves love and everyone needs to be able to be accepted. There do need to be those places. So stay on top of what's happening around you. This is not to make people alarmed as much as it's to make people informed. Find out what's happening in your city, in your town, in your country, and see if you want to be involved in educating people about movements that are knocking down the separation between church and state, that are doing things to further there not being a safe place at all for some of the people we share the planet with, and how devastating that will be for them. Thank you to Jonathon, and thank you to all of you who are listening, who care about these subjects. Take good care.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.